September 4th, 2009 started cold for Arkansas. The kind of cold that arrives in the Ozarks 2 weeks before the calendar says it should, settling into the hollows of the national forest at night and refusing to leave until well past noon. By 6 a.m., a thin mist was threading through the pines along Trail 15 near the Blanchard Springs campground. And Madison Cole was already awake in the two-person tent she shared with her boyfriend, watching the light change through the mesh panel above her. She would describe this moment years later, the particular gray-green of an Ozark morning filtering through canvas, as one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. At the time, though, she said nothing. She lay in her sleeping bag and listened to Marcus breathing and watched the mist move through the trees and thought about the day ahead. She would not make it to the afternoon. What happened between 6 a.m. on that September morning and the moment Marcus Webb walked out of the forest alone and flagged down 3 other campers to report his girlfriend missing those 5 hours that would be dissected, reassembled, disputed, and prosecuted across 18 months of criminal proceedings, is a story that a Benton County jury decided it understood in April 2011. The truth, buried inside a waterproof dry bag in the hollow of a fallen oak 900 feet off Trail 15, would require another 12 years to surface. This is the story of what those 12 years cost. Madison Cole was 23 years old in September 2009, the middle daughter of Tom and Carol Cole of Fayetteville, Arkansas. She had grown up as the connector in her family, the child who remembered everyone's birthday, who called on the hard days rather than the easy ones, who had an instinct for sensing when someone in a room was struggling that her mother described as almost uncomfortable to witness. She had studied graphic design at the University of Arkansas for 2 years before dropping out. Not from failure, but from a restlessness that the people who loved her recognized as fundamental to who she was. She didn't know yet what shape her life needed to take. She was 23 and still finding out, which was, her older sister Renee would say later, the most honest thing anyone could say about Madison at that age she was in the process of becoming. And the process was not finished. And she knew it, and she was not afraid of it. For 18 months before the camping trip, she had been waitressing at a restaurant in Fayetteville. Her manager, a woman named Jody Pressman, told investigators afterward that Madison was the employee she reached for when everything went sideways, when a section overloaded, when a cook called out, when the dinner rush became the kind of controlled disaster that restaurants occasionally produce in defiance of all preparation. She never panicked, Jody said. She got very quiet and very efficient and got through it, every time. And then afterwards she'd make a joke about it, like none of it had touched her. The co-workers who knew her outside of those crisis moments described something similar in different contexts, a woman who was genuinely present in whatever room she was in, who asked questions that suggested she had been listening more carefully than people usually did, who laughed at things that other people were still processing. Her dark hair, she cut herself with kitchen scissors in a way that always looked intentional. Her laugh started silent before it became audible, a private amusement first, the sound of it arriving a beat later like confirmation. She had been with Marcus Webb for 8 months when they drove to the Ozarks for Labor Day weekend. 8 months was long enough for her older sister Renee to have met him twice and formed the opinion that he was quieter than Madison's usual type, but that this was not necessarily a bad thing. 8 months was long enough for their mother Carol to have had him to dinner and to have noticed that he cleared his plate without being asked and offered to help with the dishes, which she had always considered more revealing than most people understood. 8 months was not long enough for anything to have gone seriously wrong. Marcus Webb was 25 years old. He worked as a line cook at a different Fayetteville restaurant, not Madison's, and he had met her at an industry social gathering that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, and that had become, unexpectedly, the occasion for a conversation that lasted 3 hours and produced an exchange of numbers and a dinner the following week. He was from Rogers, Arkansas, the second of three children. His mother, Patricia, described him as the quiet one, not withdrawn, not distant, but the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, and whose opinions, when they appeared, were more considered than the average. His older sister, Clara, said he was the person she called when something was wrong, because he was reliable in the specific way that some people are reliable, not loudly, not performatively, but with a consistency that you noticed only by its never being absent. His record before September 2009 was as unremarkable as a record can be. No prior arrests, no documented history of violence or threatening behavior. His employer at the restaurant described him as skilled and consistent, someone who had never shown a temper in a kitchen environment that routinely produced them. His landlord said he had rented the apartment for 3 years, paid on time every month, and had never once been the subject of a complaint from neighbors. The people who knew Marcus Webb described him with the vocabulary of someone who had simply never given anyone reason to think carefully about him in any particular direction. He was steady and quiet and present, and those qualities, in the courtroom in Benton County, would turn out to mean nothing at all. None of this would matter to the jury. What the camping trip had been a long weekend in a forest that Madison had wanted to return to since childhood. A chance to show Marcus a place she loved. The ordinary ambition of a 23-year-old who was still assembling the life she wanted would become, in the language of the prosecution, a relationship deteriorating toward its violent conclusion. The trip itself would become evidence. The disagreement they'd had the previous night, minor, Marcus called it, about something he couldn't even fully remember, would become motive. The forest would become a crime scene. And the woman who had woken at 6 a.m. to watch the mist move through the pines would become, in the legal record, a victim. She was not a victim. She was alive. But that truth was 14 years away from anyone who needed to hear it. The camping trip had been Madison's idea. She had been to Blanchard Springs before, as a child, the summer she turned 9, and the particular quality of the Ozark forest at that time of year had stayed with her across the intervening 14 years, in the specific way that childhood landscapes stay with people not as information, but as a felt sense, a kind of interior weather that arrived when she thought about certain kinds of light, through certain kinds of trees. She had wanted to go back for years. She had wanted to show Marcus, who had expressed an honest skepticism about camping, but had been willing to be convinced, what she meant when she said the Ozarks in early September were something worth the tent. They had left Fayetteville on the morning of September 3rd in Marcus's truck, the camping gear loaded in the bed. Lily, the playlist already playing. They had arrived at Blanchard Springs before noon and had spent the afternoon setting up their site with the improvised coordination of 2 people camping together for the first time, discovering as they went that Marcus handled the tent and Madison handled the food preparation, and that this division had not been discussed and didn't need to be. By evening, they had a fire. By dark, they had eaten, cleaned up, stored their food properly in the bear boxes, and settled into the tent with the particular contentment of people who have done something slightly effortful and been rewarded for it. The disagreement that happened that night, the one Marcus would disclose in his first interview with investigators, the one the prosecution would characterize as evidence of a deteriorating relationship, the one Marcus consistently described as minor and about something he couldn't quite remember because it was minor, was over by the time they went to sleep. They had fallen asleep in the same tent, in the same sleeping bags, and in the morning the forest was gray-green and beautiful, and Madison was awake at 6 a.m., watching the light change. She did not know, watching that light, that Dennis Roark had driven to the Blanchard Springs area the previous afternoon. She did not know he was in the campground. She had sent him the message at 11:47 p.m. "I told you I don't want to see you here. You need to leave," and she had believed it would be enough. She had been trying to end the contact for months. She had believed, because she needed to believe it, that the directness of a message sent from a campsite in the middle of a national forest would communicate something that her previous attempts to end the contact had not. She was wrong. She didn't know it yet. She was watching the light change through the mesh panel of the tent, thinking about the day ahead, listening to Marcus breathe. It was 6 a.m. on September 4th, 2009, and the forest was quiet and beautiful, and nothing about it suggested that in the next 2 hours, the shape of her life would change completely. She would not know, when the morning had finished, that a man was already walking toward their campsite through the mist. What happened next would take 14 years to fully come to light. At 8:53 a.m. on September 4th, Marcus Webb walked out of the trees near the campground's main access road and approached a family from Little Rock who were packing up their site to leave. His expression, which the father of that family would describe in court as not upset enough, was what it was controlled, pale, speaking in the flat voice of someone still processing what has happened. He told them his girlfriend was missing. He told them he had looked around the site and the nearby trail for close to an hour before coming to find help. He told them her name. He told them her name was Madison Cole. The initial search lasted 3 days. 97 volunteers, 2 K9 units, a helicopter with thermal imaging that swept the forest canopy in grids from above while teams moved through it below. Trail 15 and its branches were walked by trained searchers carrying photographs. The campsite was photographed and processed by the forensics unit from the Benton County Sheriff's Office, who found exactly what Marcus had told them they would find: Madison's sleeping bag inside the tent, her clothes in her bag, her wallet with $32, and her driver's license inside on the folding camp table, her toiletries, her snacks, her novel, everything she had brought. Her phone was not at the site, but Marcus had told them about the phone. He said she always kept it in the left pocket of her green jacket. The jacket was gone. Everything else was there. 3 days. 97 people. Nothing. The community around that nothing formed its conclusions faster than the investigation did. In Fayetteville, where Madison had lived and worked and been known by dozens of people who now talked to each other about what might have happened, the conclusion formed quietly in the first week and loudly in the second. By the third week, it was no longer a conclusion, but an assumption, and the assumption had found its object. Marcus Webb had done something to Madison Cole in a forest in the Ozarks, and the forest was large enough to have kept his secret, and the only question worth asking was when the investigation would catch up to what everyone already knew. This was not a considered judgment. It was not based on evidence, because there was none. It was the result of the absence of any other explanation, of the absence of Madison herself, of the absence of any possibility other than the one that fit the space. Marcus had been there. Madison was gone. In the grammar of fear and proximity and the human need for explanation, this produced one sentence. It produced it quickly. It produced it with the confidence of people who do not recognize that confidence and certainty are not the same thing. Marcus was aware of the assumption by the end of the first week. He could feel it in the interviews, in the way the questions shifted from information seeking to pattern seeking, in the particular quality of attention that investigators give to a person they have already decided is guilty and are now working to confirm. He said later, in the one interview he agreed to after his release, that he had understood something in those early weeks that he had not been able to articulate until much later, that the investigation was not trying to find out what had happened. It was trying to build a case for what it had already decided had happened. Those were two different projects. He had been naive enough to confuse them initially. He stopped confusing them by the time they charged him. The investigation that followed moved toward Marcus Webb the way investigations move when they have no physical evidence and must build their structure from testimony and the logic of elimination. He cooperated. He gave interviews 4 separate times across September and October 2009. Each time with more specificity, because he had nothing to hide and understood that appearing to have something to hide was worse than full transparency. He took a polygraph. He consented to searches of his apartment, his car, his phone. Every search returned nothing useful to the investigation, which meant nothing useful to his defense either, because nothing useful to a wrongful prosecution is not the same as nothing at all. In a courtroom, it looks like whatever the jury needs it to look like. The prosecution charged Marcus Webb with second-degree murder in February 2011. Their theory was that the argument they had heard about the one Marcus himself had disclosed in his very first interview, the one he described as minor, the one he said was about something he couldn't fully remember, was not the end of a disagreement, but the beginning of something worse. Their theory was that what had started as a minor argument had become, in the morning hours of September 4th, a confrontation that Marcus had ended in a way that required a forest large enough to keep secrets. The logic was circular. The absence of a body became evidence of planning. The absence of physical evidence became evidence of thoroughness. The absence of any prior history of violence became evidence that Marcus had been careful enough, in his life before September 2009, not to produce one. Everything absent became presence. Everything Marcus had provided the full cooperation, the polygraph, the 4 interviews, became evidence of a man working hard to appear cooperative, rather than evidence of a man who actually was. What they had, in legal terms, was Dennis Roark. The prosecution had spent 18 months building the case, and Dennis Roark was the entire architecture of it. His testimony, delivered in a dark suit with the rehearsed reluctance of a man who had spent months calibrating exactly how reluctant to seem, described a scenario the jury could hold in their minds as a story. An argument overheard 300 yards away, 2 voices, one angry and one frightened. He couldn't identify the words. He couldn't be certain of the genders. He had come forward, he said, because he felt he had a civic duty. Because if there was even a chance that what he'd heard was relevant, he couldn't live with himself for staying silent. The defense attempted to challenge Roark's testimony on grounds of distance and uncertainty. 300 yards, through forest, on a still morning, could he really distinguish frightened from upset? Could he really locate the source precisely enough to connect it to one specific campsite among several in the area? The defense's expert on acoustics testified about how sound moved through dense tree cover at various temperatures and under various wind conditions. The prosecution's expert testified that, under the right conditions, 300 yards in a forest was entirely within the range of identifiable sound. The jury believed the prosecution. They deliberated for 8 hours. When the 4 persons stood and read the verdict, the gallery produced a sound that courtroom observers described as not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something between the intake of breath of a room that has already decided and is now having its decision confirmed. The defense attorney made a note on his legal pad. The judge thanked the jury. Marcus Webb was handcuffed at the defense table and led out of the courtroom. Delia did not speak. She had sat in the second row of the gallery every day of the trial, through 23 days of proceedings, taking notes on a legal pad of her own, not in the manner of a person who was formally documenting anything, but in the manner of someone who understood that memory was not sufficient for what was coming, and that every detail needed to be written down. She had written down Roark's testimony word by word. She had written down the acoustics expert's measurements. She had written down the precise locations on the campground map that each witness pointed to when establishing their proximity to the Cole website. She had filled 17 pages. When the handcuffs went on, she closed the legal pad and held it against her chest and made the decision. She was not finished. The years that followed the verdict were not smooth. They were not a clean narrative of mounting hope and eventual vindication. They were a grinding series of procedural obstacles, financial strains, dead leads, and institutional indifference, interspersed with the occasional development that seemed to matter and then turned out not to matter quite enough yet. The first appeal was denied on procedural grounds in 2013, a filing deadline missed not through negligence, but through the collapse of the original appellate attorney's practice, a cascade of misfortune that meant the paperwork was filed 48 hours late and was therefore technically inadmissible. Delia spent 3 months fighting the procedural ruling. It held. The second appeal, filed in 2015, was reviewed by a different judge who read the case file and arrived at the same conclusion as the first jury, which was that Dennis Roark's testimony, combined with Marcus's admitted knowledge of an argument the previous night, and the absence of any other suspect or explanation, was legally sufficient to sustain the conviction. Legally sufficient. The two words Delia had learned to hate above all others, because they meant not provably wrong in the specific ways the law recognizes, even if clearly wrong in every way that matters. She filed for the third appeal in 2020 after Caroline Marsh joined the case pro bono, with the accumulated evidence from Ben Cho's 11 months of investigation, the gap in Roark's trail access story, the inconsistency in the campground logs, the Russellville lead. The court scheduled a hearing for August 2023. By then, Gene Hollis had already walked a spur trail in the Ozark forest and found a dry bag in a hollow tree. The hearing was never needed. What happened in the spring of 2023 made 14 years of appeals and procedural filings and visits and legal briefs simultaneously irrelevant and entirely worth it. Every step had been necessary. Every year had been necessary. Not because they had produced the outcome, but because the outcome, when it arrived, needed someone to have been ready for it. Delia was ready. She had spent 14 years making sure of that. Marcus Webb was 25 years old when he was convicted. He was 39 when he walked out. Delia Webb was 20 years old and sitting in the second row of the gallery when the foreperson read the verdict. She watched her brother's shoulders drop. She watched her mother, Patricia, 2 rows behind her, press both hands over her mouth. She watched the defense attorney make a note on his legal pad with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had already moved on to his next case. She did not cry. She made a decision. She was not finished. The decision looked like this, in practical terms, over the years that followed: 2 jobs, 7 days a week, for the first 4 years, a grocery store during the day, a cleaning company on weekends, and every dollar she could extract beyond rent and food going toward attorney fees and appeal filings and the private investigator she would eventually hire in 2018. The first appeal was denied in 2013 on procedural grounds. She read the denial 3 times and called Caroline Marsh, the pro bono attorney who had agreed to take Marcus's case in 2020 after a newspaper article, and said, "What do we do next?" They always did something next. What that looked like from the outside was stubborn. What it looked like from the inside was something Delia has never found quite the right word for, a kind of love that has burned through all its soft qualities and arrived at something harder and more functional, a love that has become almost indistinguishable from will. She was not under any illusion that love alone would free Marcus. Love had not freed him when she'd had it in its full original form on the day they took him away. She had understood from the verdict that love was the fuel, not the tool. And the tool was something she needed to build. She built it 1 month at a time. The monthly visits to Cummins' unit became the architecture around which she organized everything else. First Sunday of every month, 3.5-hour drive south from Fayetteville. She never missed one. Not in January 2015, when her car broke down outside Benton and she borrowed her neighbor's truck without asking and left a note on his kitchen table. Not in the winter of 2017, when a storm closed the highway and she drove the long route through Stuttgart, adding 90 minutes each way, and arriving at the visiting room 40 minutes late, with wet boots and case notes on her phone. Not in the fall of 2019 when she had pneumonia and wore a surgical mask for the entire visit, while Marcus told her she looked terrible, and she told him she knew, and then they worked through the Russellville lead for 2 hours until the guard told them visiting time was over. She didn't come to comfort me, Marcus said after his release. Other families comfort each other in those rooms. Delia came to work. She came to tell me what she'd found and what the next step was. That's how I knew she believed me, not because she said she believed me, but because she kept treating my case like a problem that had a solution. Like it was just a matter of finding the right angle. He paused when he said this. Then he said, she was right. Their mother, Patricia Webb, had been in the courtroom every day of the trial and had pressed both hands over her mouth when the verdict came, and had spent the first year of Marcus's incarceration writing letters to prosecutors and judges and state representatives and anyone whose address she could find. By the third year, the letters had stopped, not because she had stopped believing him, not because she had stopped loving him, but because there is a particular damage that comes from sustained ineffectiveness, from doing everything available and watching it produce nothing, that eventually reaches the point where continuing to do those things costs more than stopping them. Patricia Webb reached that point. She was not ashamed of it. She told Delia once that stopping the letters was the hardest thing she had ever done. Delia said she understood. She did. She kept going, though, because one person in a family has to keep going. And Delia Webb had decided at age 20 in a courtroom gallery that person was her, and she had not undecided it since. In 2017, she connected with the Innocence Project, which reviewed the case file and confirmed the legal reality. The conviction was circumstantially constructed, legally vulnerable in theory, practically unassailable, without new evidence. The phone records from Dennis Roark's original contact with investigators had been subpoenaed in the original case and had produced nothing incriminating because Roark and Madison had communicated through a separate platform whose records had not been requested, because no one investigating the case had known to look for that particular thread. The Innocence Project told Delia what they needed. She began trying to find it. She was looking specifically for Madison Cole, not for evidence that she was dead, for evidence that she was alive. This was not something she announced. The conviction was for murder. Madison's death was so thoroughly embedded in the legal and public record that suggesting she might have survived, might have run, might have chosen to disappear, would have made Delia sound exactly like what everyone already thought she was, a desperate sister unwilling to accept reality. So she looked quietly. Missing persons databases, age progression software, social media across 7 states. She wrote down physical characteristics that would be harder to change than hair or name, the small scar above Madison's left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the particular way she held her shoulders when standing still, the laugh that started silent. She wrote these down, and she kept them as the list of what she was looking for. 3 times over 7 years she thought she had found something. 3 times she was wrong. The 3rd time she came closest the Russellville lead, the woman at the motel in 2010, the name that wasn't Madison, but the face that could have been, and when that lead went cold in Memphis, she sat in her car outside the storage facility that was supposed to be an apartment, and she said nothing for several minutes. Then she called Ben Cho and said, "What did we miss?" Ben said, "Nothing yet. Let's keep looking." She needed to hear that. She kept looking. Gene Hollis had retired from the U.S. Forest Service in 2019 after 31 years in the Ozark St. Francis forests. He had spent those 3 decades acquiring the kind of knowledge that no training can fully replicate, the knowledge of a man who has walked the same land in every season for 31 years and has ceased to need to think consciously about where he is. He knew where the deer bedded in January. He knew which sections of trail held ice in late March while the rest had already thawed. He knew the spot on Trail 15, where, on a clear day in early April, you could hear the first wood thrush before the leaves came in full enough to muffle it. This knowledge was not something he carried deliberately. It had simply accumulated until it was indistinguishable from the man himself. In retirement, staying out of the woods was not a condition he could sustain for more than 3 days at a stretch. He walked Trail 15 every March for the migration, had done it since 1994, 29 consecutive marches. He knew the trail the way a musician knows a piece played hundreds of times, not as information, but as memory embedded in the body, retrieved automatically, below the level of conscious thought. He also walked the unmarked spur that had been closed since 2015. He knew about the erosion. He had written the erosion report himself. The erosion was real and was a genuine reason to close the trail to casual use, and Gene was not casual. The overlook at the spur's end was where he had watched the spring migration every March since 1998, and closing a trail he had walked for 25 years was not something an erosion advisory could accomplish. In March 2023, the spur was 8 years unmaintained. The erosion had continued. In places, the original path had been so thoroughly reclaimed by the forest floor that a person without the muscle memory of it would not have recognized it as a trail at all. Gene moved through it the way he had always moved through it, his feet, finding the solid ground without his eyes having to search, his body angled automatically at the 2 places where the slope required it, his pace adjusting to the surface without thought. He reached the overlook at 9:03. He stayed for 12 minutes, watching a pair of ruby-throated hummingbirds working the red buds on the hillside below. At 9:15, he turned back toward the main trail. He found the dry bag at 9:17. The fallen oak was not where it had been the last time he'd come this way 3 seasons ago, he thought. Maybe 4. It had been standing then. Now it lay at an angle against a younger beech, its root ball partially separated from the ground. The weight of it shifted by 3 winters of freeze and thaw into a new configuration that had created a sheltered hollow at the junction of the root ball and the slope. The olive-green dry bag was visible at the lower edge of that hollow, one strap snagged on a broken root stub, the rest of it buried under leaf litter and debris. Moss had colonized the strap completely. The bag itself was sealed. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. 9 years of rain and freeze-thaw cycles working over whatever was inside. The bag was military-grade waterproof, the kind designed for backcountry conditions, specifically engineered to maintain a sealed interior environment regardless of external conditions. Whatever was inside might be ruined, might be nothing, might be gear from some hiker who had dropped it in 2015 and never noticed. Gene had found things in forest for 31 years. He had learned not to decide what he'd found before carrying it out. He freed the bag from the root stub. He carried it to his truck. He drove to the nearest ranger station and said, "I found something on the spur off Trail 15. I think you should look at it." The forensics technician at the state crime lab who opened the bag 9 days later was a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had worked evidence for 17 years. She had seen phones recovered from flooded basements, from house fires, from cars pulled out of rivers. She had seen what water did to electronics and what time did to paper. She had calibrated her expectations accordingly. She was not prepared for what was inside. The phone was a first-generation iPhone, sealed inside a secondary waterproof case within the outer bag, a system of concentric protection that spoke of someone who had understood they were making something that needed to last. Sandra removed it carefully, photographed it in situ, placed it on the examination table. Then she reached into the outer bag and removed the freezer bag. Inside the freezer bag was a folded piece of paper. The paper had yellowed at the edges and softened slightly with age, but it was intact, and the handwriting on it was clear. My name is Madison Cole. September 4th, 2009, he brought me here. I left this where I could. If anyone finds this Dr. Dennis Roark, he knows where I went. Sandra Okafor set the note down. She read it a second time. Then she made a phone call to the lead detective on the original case file, who had retired in 2018, but whose personal number was still in the investigation system, because sometimes retired detectives needed to be called. The phone took 9 days to revive. The battery was beyond restoration, but the storage media was intact. What the forensics team extracted from it was the complete message history between Madison Cole and Dennis Roark, a conversation that stretched back to July 2009, 2 months before the camping trip. The messages documented what they documented: a man who had made contact through a catering event, whose attention had intensified through the summer, whose presence in Madison's messages had shifted from professional courtesy to something else, and whose final message to her on the night of September 3rd, sent at 11:22 p.m., was a set of coordinates. The coordinates were for the hollow of a fallen oak, 900 feet off Trail 15. He had told her where to meet him. She had not gone. She had sent back 3 words: "Do not come." And then, at 11:47 p.m., her final message: "I told you I don't want to see you here. You need to leave." Roark had not left. He had gone to her instead. What happened next changed everything. What happened next changed everything in a prison cell in Lincoln County, Arkansas. What happened next changed everything in an apartment in Little Rock, where a 34-year-old woman was eating breakfast before a workday that was about to be interrupted by a phone call she had been waiting 14 years to receive. What happened next changed everything in Knoxville, Tennessee, where a woman who had been keeping herself small and careful for 13 years was about to discover that the things she had hidden in a forest on a September morning in 2009 had finally been found. The investigation that followed moved with a velocity that 14 years of appeals had never achieved, the velocity of a case that has found its physical anchor at last. Roark's original testimony was re-examined against the phone records with the specific focus of investigators who now knew exactly what they were looking at. The gap that Ben Cho had identified in 2019, the forestry maintenance record showing that the section of trail Roark claimed to have been on was closed for equipment work on September 4th, was now not an inconsistency, but a confirmation. A man cannot be on a trail that is closed. He can, however, be somewhere else entirely. A search warrant for Roark's Benton County property was issued and executed on May 22, 2023. What the search produced, in terms of additional physical evidence, the prosecutorial team subsequently declined to detail publicly. What they did confirm was that the combination of the phone's message history, the trail maintenance records, and the results of the property search constituted a case they could not responsibly continue to oppose. Dennis Roark was arrested on June 7, 2023. His attorney, after reviewing the evidence, advised him to cooperate. He cooperated for 3 days. What he confirmed in those 3 days of interviews was the account that the phone and the note had already made unavoidable. He had been at the campsite on the morning of September 4th. He had approached Madison before dawn, while Marcus was asleep. The confrontation that followed was one that Roark had planned and Madison had not expected, and which had ended with Madison running into the forest in the direction of the closed spur trail, a direction Roark had not pursued because he had not known, in the dark, in the unfamiliar terrain, which way she had gone. He had believed she would come out eventually. He had been wrong. Madison had run. She had gotten deep enough into the forest that she was no longer findable without knowing where to look. She had stayed hidden until she was certain he was gone. And then she had made the choice that would shape the next 14 years of 2 people's lives. She had moved east through the Ozarks for the rest of that morning, with no phone, no plan. and the single-pointed clarity of someone operating on adrenaline through unfamiliar terrain. She knew the forest was large. Large was safer than small. She moved until she could no longer hear anything behind her, and the light had shifted enough to tell her it was mid-morning and she was alone. She found the dry bag in the hollow of the fallen oak, someone else's abandoned gear. The double waterproofing still intact, and she understood what waterproofing meant for the phone she still had in her jacket pocket. The jacket had not been left at the campsite. She had been wearing it. She sat in the hollow for a long time and thought about what to do. Then she wrote the note on a page from a small notebook she always carried, sealed the phone inside, and lodged the bag back in the hollow as deep as she could get it. And then she walked east. She reached a highway by afternoon. She accepted a ride without explaining where she was going or why. She found work in Nashville that paid in cash and asked no questions. She moved twice in the first year. She was careful in the specific way that someone is careful when they understand that careful is the only thing standing between them and the man they are hiding from. She had not, in the immediate aftermath, been able to think clearly about Marcus. Shock narrowed cognition to immediate survival, and survival was what she had. By 2012, when she found the article about the conviction on a library computer, she had built 3 years of carefully constructed ordinary life in Nashville. The article dismantled it. Not the life the functional structure held, but the belief that she could eventually go back. Going back meant Roark knowing she was alive. Roark knowing she was alive meant a response from Roark. The arithmetic was terrible, and it was clear, and it produced the same answer every time she worked through it. Marcus in prison, Roark free, Madison safe only while invisible. She moved to Knoxville in 2014. She found steadier work. She kept the accounting books for a small construction company. She had an apartment with 2 cats and a vegetable garden on the balcony that produced more tomatoes each summer than she could use. She thought about Marcus every year on the anniversary of the conviction. She thought about him on September 4th and on her own birthday and on days when the accounting work brought her into contact with numbers that were someone else's story and she had no story she was allowed to tell. She was not proud of the choice she had made. She also understood that most people in her specific circumstances would have made the same one. She was 37 years old when investigators found her in Knoxville in July 2023. What they told her about the dry bag, about Gene Hollis, about the phone's message history and the note, and what it had produced she received in the specific stillness of someone doing the mathematics of a situation that has no clean solution. Investigator Sybil Danvers, who had spent 11 years in cold case work and had delivered difficult news in dozens of rooms, described the silence in that particular room as the most complete she had encountered in her career. Madison Cole sat across from her and absorbed the information that her survival, which she had built in the belief that it was protecting herself, had cost someone she cared about 14 years of his life. Both things were true simultaneously. The survival had been real. The cost had been real. Neither of those facts resolved the other. The silence was the sound of someone understanding this completely. Roark was charged with unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault, evidence tampering, and perjury, the perjury charge relating specifically to his testimony at a murder trial that had produced a wrongful conviction. The legal proceedings that followed moved through the Arkansas courts across the remainder of 2023 and into 2024. And the question of what the state owed Marcus Webb moved alongside them, unanswered, because the gap between what is owed and what can actually be given is a gap that legal systems are not, in the end, designed to close. Marcus was released on June 19, 2023, 14 years and 78 days. Delia Webb had been in the Cummins Unit parking lot since 8 a.m. She had parked in the blind spot she had identified on her third visit, 14 years ago, a position at the edge of the lot outside the sight lines of the main entrance. Not for any practical reason, but because the visits had always been hers and Marcus's, not performances, and she had wanted to keep them that way to the end. The journalists had found out about the release and were positioned at the perimeter. She had nothing to say to them. She stood outside her car in the June heat and did not check her phone, and she waited. At 9:41 a.m., Marcus walked through the processing exit. He was 39 years old. The 14 years were in his face and in the way he moved, the careful recalibration of someone relearning the dimensions of unscheduled space, the slight hesitation at every threshold. He saw Delia before he saw anything else, before the journalists, before the parking lot, before the sky. He stopped. He crossed to her. She had not cried at his conviction. She had not cried through 4 appeals, 14 years of first Sundays, 100 visiting room goodbyes. She had decided in April of 2011 that tears were energy she couldn't afford. And she had honored that decision with the same consistency she brought to everything else. She put her face against his shoulder and cried for the first time since the verdict. Nobody photographed it. The moment belonged entirely to them. He spent the first weeks in Patricia's house in Rogers, in his childhood bedroom, relearning the texture of days with no external schedule. He sat in the backyard for hours. He cooked for Patricia and Delia and the small circle of people who moved through those first weeks, and found that his hands remembered the work completely, the knife angles, the fire management, the precise sequencing that a good line cook develops until it becomes reflexive. He had been away from it for 14 years. His hands had not. He described this in the one brief interview he agreed to give as the most hopeful thing since his release. Not the freedom, not the exoneration, not the sky without razor wire. The fact that his hands still knew exactly what to do. Muscle memory. 14 years, and his hands still knew. Madison Cole came to Arkansas in August 2023. She drove from Knoxville alone, which was how she had moved through most things for the past 14 years. She drove straight through, stopping once for gas and coffee in Nashville, arriving in Fayetteville at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday. She had not been in Arkansas since September 2009. The drive through the state, on the familiar highways, past the familiar exit signs, produced in her a quality of recognition that she had not been prepared for the specific pain of returning to a geography you loved before it became the geography of the worst thing that ever happened to you. She had one reason for coming. She had made the request through Caroline Marsh. Would Marcus Webb agree to meet her? Marcus had said yes without a long deliberation. Delia, when Caroline called to relay the answer, had said he didn't hesitate. Madison, when she heard this, had to pull over for a moment. The meeting lasted 2 hours. It happened in a room that no third party was present for, and that neither Marcus nor Madison has described publicly. What has been confirmed is that both of them showed up, that Marcus was already there when Madison arrived, and that he stood when she came through the door, and that neither of them spoke for a moment, and that whatever was said in those 2 hours began the process incomplete, ongoing, not resolvable by a single conversation or a year of them, of two people accounting to each other for what the same event had cost each of them. They have not spoken publicly about what was said. They are not required to. Some conversations are not owed to anyone outside the people having them. What has been said in the months since by people who know them both, that both of them showed up. That showing up, given what had preceded it, was already the hardest thing. That everything else, whatever it becomes, begins from there. Delia Webb was 20 years old and not finished. She is 34 now, and she is still not finished, in the specific way that people who have understood what the work is are not finished, not because the work is incomplete, but because the kind of person you become by doing it for 14 years does not stop being that person when the specific case is resolved. She is still the woman who drove 3.5 hours on first Sundays, She is still the woman who took the Stuttgart route in a winter storm. She is still the woman who made a decision in a courtroom gallery at age 20 and did not undecide it. That person does not stop working. She finds other people who need what she learned to do, and she does it with them. Marcus Webb cooked dinner for 14 people at Patricia's house in Rogers in October 2023, the extended family and a few close friends, the first gathering that had felt something like a celebration in 14 years. He made a brisket and a lentil soup and 3 kinds of bread, including the bread he always made badly with a cheerful optimism about next time. Except this time, the bread was good. He did not know why this time it was good when so many previous times it hadn't been. He suspected it had something to do with the particular attention he was now able to give to things in front of him, now that the thing behind him had resolved. Attention, it turned out, was what Bread had always needed from him. He had simply not had it available to give. She has said, when asked what kept her going, that the answer is both simpler and more complicated than people expect. The simple part is, she believed her brother. Not in spite of the evidence, there was no evidence, but in the specific way that people believe other people when they have known them their entire lives and understand the difference between the person they are and the crime they are alleged to have committed. Marcus was not capable of this. She knew this the way she knew anything she had learned before she was old enough to learn things in the body, before language. The complicated part is, believing him was not enough. Believing him had never been enough. What was required was not belief, but work. And the work was something she did not stop doing because stopping would have been a different kind of belief. A belief in the outcome she was refusing to accept, and that was the one belief she could not afford. Gene Hollis has gone back to walking Trail 15. He attended one press conference in June 2023 and stood at the back and answered 2 questions and left when the questions became more than 2. In his only extended interview, conducted in his living room by a reporter from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, he said he had walked the spur trail every March for 25 years and had found the dry bag this particular March because a fallen oak had shifted during the winter and the bag had become visible. He said he had no particular thought while carrying the bag to his truck except that objects found in remote places needed to come out of those places and be examined. He said he did not consider himself to have solved anything. He said the forest had held the thing and he had carried it out. He said he understood his part of this and he was fine with his part of this. He was right. But the part he understood carrying what the forest holds, back to where it can be used, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the entire thing. The note and the phone were always there. The message history was always there. The coordinates of Dennis Roark's lie were always there, preserved in an olive green dry bag in the hollow of a fallen oak, waiting for someone who knew where to walk to come along and carry them out. Some records take 14 years to find. Some find the right person at exactly the right moment. This one found Gene Hollis on a March morning after a winter that had shifted a fallen oak just enough. And what he carried out of the forest that day was not just an evidence bag. It was the answer to a question that had been waiting since September 4th, 2009, for someone to ask it in the right place. Delia Webb was 20 years old, with $40 in her account and not finished. She turned out to be right about that. 14 years is a long time to be right about something. It is also, given what the alternative was, exactly as long as it needed to be, and not one day longer than necessary, and not one day shorter than the truth required. Some people are found by the things they never thought to leave behind. Madison Cole left a phone and a note in a hollow tree on a September morning in 2009, not knowing if it would ever be found, not knowing if finding it would be enough, hiding it in the desperate logic of someone buying time against an outcome she could not yet see. The time it bought was 14 years. The outcome it prevented was permanent. The cost of those 14 years was paid by someone who had no say in the transaction, and that cost will not be settled by any legal proceeding. And both things are true. And the truth of both of them does not resolve each other. The forest kept what it was given. It always does. It keeps things in hollow places and beneath shifting roots and in the slow preservation of the dark, and it does not lose them. It holds them until the right person comes along with the knowledge of where to walk and the professional habit of not leaving anomalies unexamined. Some doors can only be opened from the inside by the person who locked them. Madison Cole opened hers on a September morning in 2009 with a handwritten note and a dead phone in a waterproof bag, and it took 14 years for the right person to find it and carry it out. She was not the kind of woman who gave up. She was not the kind of woman who forgot. She left what she could, where she could, and waited for the world to catch up.